The VMware Explore keynote today was all about private cloud and how private cloud can, on the one hand, enable developers to be more productive because they can define all of the infrastructure they need in the form of code, which then allows operators to manage that infrastructure and to provide network storage, compute, security, AI models, everything that those developers need in a consistent way across different locations. Because private cloud in VMware's definition does not just mean on premises, it means everywhere where the VMware Cloud Foundation stack runs is private cloud. So that can also be on AWS and GCP, on Azure, on IBM Cloud, and anywhere else too. So recently, VMware announced Kubernetes as they call it, a first-class citizen, or better, containers as first-class citizens on vSphere. And that means that vSphere now runs containers on upstream Kubernetes just the same way as it runs VMs, so that you can use the same policies to control what's going on with containers and VMs at the same time in a consistent manner. So there is not these two worlds anymore of containers on the one hand and virtual machines on the other. On vSphere, you can now run upstream Kubernetes. I think they support the last 3 versions of upstream Kubernetes, and at the same time, virtual machines on a hypervisor. And what that lets you do is you get all of those features that VMware brings, like vMotion and dynamic resource allocation and backup, high availability, all of those capabilities vSphere had for VMs, you can now also have for Kubernetes containers. And obviously, vice versa, you can have the scalability of Kubernetes and the advantages of the Kubernetes orchestration platform for virtual machines. And what that brings is that ability to run legacy applications that have been in the corporate portfolio for a decade or 2 or 3, side by side with cloud-native applications, containerized applications. And that also means that you don't need to containerize everything and modernize everything, because as we all know, that's not what enterprises want to do. They only want to modernize when it actually brings customer value, not just so that virtual machines are now containerized. That's really not all that relevant. This means the story of having one private cloud that runs Kubernetes and has Kubernetes orchestrate containers across clusters that can be anywhere, that is a really interesting value proposition. And all of this is about developer productivity, because the argument is that developers can use code to define absolutely everything in the environment that they need. And then it's the job of the operators to make sure all of the stuff really materializes in a compliant and efficient manner. That is the key story. And you have to really applaud VMware for this extreme focus on private cloud and on this story of absolute consistency. That's where VMware comes from. That is capitalizing on their big advantage that they have, because they run often thousands of enterprise applications in large companies at least. So whatever you may think of the portfolio reorganization that we've seen recently and the whole one SKU thing, from a business perspective for VMware, what they're doing now, this absolute focus on private cloud and on providing their customers with one easy to operate, consistent platform that makes developers more productive, that is a strategy, as I said, you can only applaud. Will that work in the end? That really depends on how they end up executing, because obviously there's a lot of customers, a lot of partners that are looking around, that do not see VMware as their number one choice for cloud-native applications for any number of reasons. But at the end of the day, what VMware wants to achieve is that they change their mind and that they ultimately say, yes, at the end of the day, I care about making my developers more productive while at the same time running my infrastructure, my application portfolio securely in a compliant manner at a reasonable cost so that it's portable, you're not getting yourself locked in. And if VMware can offer all of that, then they ultimately, customers, even though they may be upset now, they do not have a reason to take any chances on migrating somewhere else. One of the announcements today actually underlines that ambition of VMware to really become that one platform where everybody works together in harmony, because they are now working together with Canonical, and they're provisioning the Canonical Ubuntu Linux operating system. So the standard upstream Ubuntu. They are delivering, or they're offering this now, fully supported by Canonical as a part of the VCF stack. So that gap between Kubernetes and the Linux operating system gets filled, because that gap is key. And there is, for example, Red Hat with RHEL and OpenShift, where RHEL and OpenShift are very closely tied together, and one company supports them both and leads the development in both. That has tremendous advantages when you think about that Kubernetes uses roughly 100 out of 300 something possible system calls for the Linux kernel to orchestrate its container environments, to deploy containers, to scale them, to move them. All of the things that Kubernetes does, it needs Linux system calls, and a lot of them. And whenever something goes wrong, or in a lot of cases when something goes wrong, it is at that interfacing point between Kubernetes and Linux. And at the end of the day, controlling that point and supporting that point is something that VMware just had to do to fill this gap, and they filled this gap now. So very interesting, very interesting. And obviously, Ubuntu is very popular because when you have virtual machines on Amazon, you usually run them on Ubuntu Linux. So it has a massive market share in that regard. Another interesting announcement was the VMware Private AI Services. I think that's the name, Private AI Services, where they are now offering basically the ability to develop, to run, to deploy, to manage any, I think it's actually any LLM through their Tanzu application platform. So that if you want Bedrock, you can do that. If you want something else, basically anything, you can do that as well. And you can do that. You can manage those AI models and those AI applications through their entire life cycle, including you can use vMotion, as they gave, one of them gave a nice, I think it was Sabina Anja, who gave this nice example. You can use and apply vMotion to move LLMs to a better place, and you can scale them with DRS. You can do all kinds of things. And they are now making that part of the VCF overall portfolio, which all goes down to one SKU, so that you have everything that you need to develop cloud native apps on the one hand and to run traditional apps on the other. That is a solid strategy, that by itself. But of course, there are issues with that strategy. And those are not necessarily issues that VMware can address conclusively today. But one of the key issues that we've been talking about for a while is that when you run private cloud and you put your workloads on private cloud and then you run it on AWS or on Azure or on GCP, you can use that as a jumping board to go to ultimately EC2 or Azure VMs or the Google equivalent. That is a risk, and VMware needs to make sure that does not happen. And to make sure that that does not happen, they have all of those Tanzu application services where you get all the Cloud Foundry stuff, but you also get capabilities for Python and for other development languages. And honestly, how strong the Python story is and the story for other development languages, we need to look into a little bit more, because one of the things they mentioned a lot was Spring AI. And Spring AI is the Java framework for developing and running applications that use LLMs. And yeah, it needs to be balanced. It cannot just be Java, because that's a big issue and a big shortcoming of Cloud Foundry overall. So it is an area that we have to take a good look at. And at the end of the day, VMware needs to create this overall platform without, and this is maybe something that I can criticize a little bit, because the undertone is very much, oh, we are better than public cloud. We have better products, we have better, and by products we mean APIs, we have better security, we have lower costs that we can get you ultimately. So it's better. There's no real reason to go to public cloud, and that's simply not true for many reasons. And the key reason to me, as somebody who can very closely relate to developers, is that developers like simple APIs and the latest and greatest APIs. And you want to be able to very easily use when Amazon launches something new that really makes things a lot easier for you as a developer, instead of deploying your whole LLM privately and building all this whole capability. You may just want to consume it very quickly through an API. And I was missing that a little bit, that acknowledgement a little bit, even though when you go to the show floor and you look at the demo of the tiles that you get with the application platform, the Tanzu application platform, that you can insert a lot of those capabilities. So you can do RDS, you can do OpenAI services from Azure, you can do, I think there is not necessarily a limit with what you can include as a tile into the application platform, but positioning it in a way that says, yeah, you don't really need all of this because you have a full lifecycle management for your own private LLMs. That is a little bit tricky, because most enterprises are not going to buy that, simply because that's not how developers operate. How that will play out in the end will be largely up to how VMware actually positions this and builds this out in their platform. Because as I said, the platform generally supports these third-party services and doesn't care what they are. But then from a lifecycle management perspective, from an overall integration perspective, that goes beyond single sign-on and adding it to a tab and then adding it to infrastructure as code. It has to be properly integrated and part of the strategy. And of course, if you play against AWS and the hyperscalers, they're also going to play against you, and it's not necessarily what you want. Yeah, that's really it. I was missing the term hybrid cloud. I didn't hear the term hybrid cloud at all. And yeah, I wish I had. But at the end of the day, that was today. There was the keynote and day one at VMware Explore. Very interesting. And yeah, I hope you got something out of my brief summary.